Hello and welcome to the Pilot 365 YouTube channel. I'm Timothy McMichael, a Senior Support Escalation Engineer with Microsoft, and today's topic is planning distribution list migrations to Office 365 using the DL Conversion v2 PowerShell migration module. Migrating distribution lists to Office 365 often requires planning and organization. There's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution to this question. Unlike mailboxes, though, the goal for distribution lists, in my opinion, should not be to migrate everything. When we're looking at what to migrate and when to migrate it, the first question I ask is, what is the purpose of migrating the distribution list? What problem within the organization does migrating the distribution list solve? And that tends to be the first question that I use in my planning on how we're going to proceed with a migration. There's also a lot of complicating factors that you need to consider when it comes to DLs and whether or not they're candidates for migration. For example, groups can be nested, and unraveling nesting and tracking nesting can often be complicated. Groups can also have security dependencies, both in the on-premises Active Directory and the Office 365 platform outside of Exchange Online that are not easily discoverable. And groups very often have a lack of a defined owner, or even where an owner is defined, they do not know what the group is used for. So finding someone to gather knowledge on how these lists are used in the environment can often be challenging. When it comes to discovering how lists are utilized within your environment, there really is not an efficient manner to make that determination. There's no single report that tells you a DL is used for this security principle, or a DL has been emailed this many times within the last 6 months. Your message tracking logs often provide some insight into this, but it requires manual data gathering, and it is often an inefficient data pool. In other words, the query needs to be run over and over and over again for a period of time, and at that rate, the Mailflow usage is only reflected for the period of time in which the message tracking logs were searched. Not being able to have a solid understanding of how these objects are utilized in the environment often makes planning and migration complicated. So one strategy I like to recommend to customers using the DL Conversion v2 migration module is to organize your lists into 4 buckets. These go from what I consider to be the least complicated to more complicated, even though complications can exist within each bucket, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The 4 buckets I like to take a look at are mail-enabled distribution lists with a defined owner, mail-enabled security groups with a defined owner, mail distribution lists that lack an owner, and then your mail-enabled security groups that lack an owner. I like to start with mail-enabled distribution lists that have a defined owner as my simplest set. I find when working with most of my customers that these DLs tend to be simple, and migrating them also has a purpose. One of the major concerns after mailbox migrations with distribution lists is the inability of end users to manage their DL membership, which usually drives the migration conversation for a lot of my customers. In addition to these lists being simple, they also have no known security dependencies across Active Directory or Office 365. Also, since these groups have a defined owner, the hopes, although not always the case, is that the owner understands why the list exists and gives us a resource to interrogate should we need more information on whether that DL is a candidate for migration or what functions it serves in the environment. My second bucket are the mail-enabled security groups with defined owner. I consider these to have the same benefits as our mail-enabled distribution lists with a defined owner, with the additional complicating factor that they are security. Because these lists are security, they could have any number of permissions in either Active Directory or Office 365, which may not be easily discoverable. So an attempt to make an analysis of the security usage of these groups is important prior to determining if they are candidates for migration. Migrating a DL to Office 365 using the DL Conversion v2 migration module requires the deletion and recreation of the group in Office 365. If permissions are assigned within Office 365, they could be lost. For example, let's say a mail-enabled distribution list is utilized to provide access to a SharePoint document library. If that list is migrated, the deletion and recreation, although it results in a group that looks the same, is not the same group within the directory, and those permissions would be lost. Migrating them does, though, restore the ability for end users to manage their DL membership, as well as hopefully having a defined owner allows us to ask someone what either the security and/or mail flow usage of that group is, as we determine whether or not it is a candidate for migration. My third bucket are mail-enabled distribution lists that do not have a defined owner. Now here the concerns are exactly the same as a mail-enabled distribution list with a defined owner, with the exception that there is no owner to interrogate as to why the group exists or what its usage is for. This leaves most of the analysis up to the administrator to determine whether or not this distribution list is a candidate for migration and why and what purpose the migration would serve. My fourth and last bucket are our mail-enabled security groups without a defined owner. The considerations for these groups are exactly the same as our mail-enabled security groups with a defined owner. The exception here is that we don't have an owner to go ask what the purpose of security or mail flow is with these groups. It's up to the administrator performing the migrations to do an analysis to make that determination on their own. This can be a significantly complicating factor when determining if these groups are a candidate for migration. My last bucket, which I consider to be the most complex, are our mail-enabled security groups without a defined owner. The considerations are essentially the same as our mail-enabled security groups with a defined owner, other than we don't have anyone to ask if it's not immediately discoverable, what is the purpose of the group or what permissions does it provide? This can cause some additional complexity when determining if these groups are candidates for migration. What happens to a group in Active Directory after a migration is completed? When the migration is complete, the group is moved back to the OU that it was originally in. Keep in mind that in order to satisfy the deletion, there's a temporary time where the group is moved to an OU that does not sync. After the group is moved back to the OU that it previously resided in, all mail attributes associated with the group are stripped off. This essentially leaves either a distribution list or security group left in the directory. To prevent any potential naming conflicts in the future, an exclamation point is added to the end of the group's name. By adding it to the end of the name, we preserve any group naming prefixes as well as the search and sort order of that group within the directory. Now, administrators may choose to have the group deleted as a part of the migration. There is a switch, Retain Original Group, which if specified false will delete the group post-migration. The only exception to this is that if the group is of type security. If the group is a mail-enabled security group, it is retained regardless of whether or not the administrator chooses to delete it as part of the migration. This requires the administrator to use Active Directory users and computers or another utility to manually delete that group. I do recommend that you enable the Active Directory recycle bin to provide some measure of recoverability should something become deleted that you wish to retain. There are several security group considerations in Active Directory as a result of migrating a mail-enabled security group to Office 365. As reviewed previously, the group is retained in the original organization unit, the mail attributes are stripped, and the group is renamed with an exclamation point. By doing so, none of the permissions assigned within Active Directory are lost as a result of the migration. The group can be manually deleted by the administrator at a later time. Now, the one thing that does impact security potentially is the fact that some customers leveraged end-user distribution list management to impact security principles and access to resources. For example, I worked with a customer who had a work group that had file shares. Those file shares were permissioned with mail-enabled security groups with a defined owner of the manager of that work group. When someone was brought into the work group, the manager would add them to the mail-enabled security group through Outlook, thereby providing permissions to the file shares that work group leveraged. In this particular instance, when you migrate the mail-enabled security group to Office 365, there is no link between the membership in Active Directory any longer and the membership of that group in Office 365. That business process would now be broken. The mail functions of the group can be migrated to Office 365 while leveraging the security group in Active Directory without creating the group in Office 365 as security. Some customers use the migration process as a time to ask themselves whether or not a group needs to be mail-enabled security in order to be migrated to the cloud. The DL Conversion v2 migration module does support the group type override switch and allows administrators to specify or override the group type that they want created in Office 365. So when you're doing your group analysis, if you determine that the group needs to be retained in Active Directory as security, but in Office 365 it only needs to be created as distribution, you can specify the group type override and it will be created as distribution. The only exception to this is that if any of the information gathered during the migration process determines that the only way to successfully migrate the group is as a security group. Even if you specify distribution, that setting will be overridden and the group will be created as security. It's important to note that in Office 365, you cannot change the group type after it is created. If you create the group as distribution, the only way to make it security in the future would be to delete and recreate it, and vice versa. There are several considerations when migrating security groups in Office 365. Some of these we've talked about previously. When you have security groups, they're leveraged across multiple platforms for security permissions: SharePoint, Exchange Online, Teams, etc. Each group that is created in Office 365 has unique identifiers, very similar to Active Directory. The migration process again leverages the deletion and recreation of the group in Office 365. By deleting and recreating the group, these security identifiers are changed. It is possible that the new group will not have the same permissions as the old group if those permissions are not manually reset post-migration. The DL Conversion v2 migration module does have several PowerShell commands that administrators can leverage to audit permissions within the Exchange on-premises or Exchange Online environment in order to service a full fidelity migration. There is not, though, a comprehensive method to audit permissions assignments in other offerings, for example, SharePoint or OneDrive. Earlier, I outlined my 4 buckets for migration from what I consider to be least complex to most complex. It is possible, though, to have complexity within each one of those buckets, and sometimes one of the complex things we discuss is nested DLs. The DL Conversion v2 migration module supports both individual DL migrations as well as batched groups of migrations. It is important to note that when doing a migration, a parent cannot be migrated prior to its children. All children DLs have to be migrated first. In the event of performing single DL migrations, if a parent is specified before a child, the migration will fail. In the event of multiple migrations, if the parent and all children are included in the same migration batch, the multi-DL migration process has the ability to come back and retry the parent upon successful migration of all the children. In a future presentation, I'll cover the nested distribution list migration process and the multiple batched migrations. When planning a distribution list migration to Office 365, one question I always ask is, does the Exchange on-premises infrastructure, if present, continue to relay email to Office 365? It is not uncommon for the Exchange on-premises infrastructure to act as a relay for applications, mailboxes that still exist on premises, or other devices that need to be able to send email to mailboxes or recipients in Office 365. As we discussed earlier, post-migration, the original group is mail disabled and renamed. This would effectively remove the mail object that exists in the on-premises directory. The DL Conversion v2 migration module does have a switch called Enable Hybrid Mailflow. This switch is not on by default. When the Enable Hybrid Mailflow switch is used, objects are created within Active Directory that Exchange can utilize to continue to email the distribution lists that exist in Office 365, even though they are no longer fully present in the on-premises Active Directory. In a future presentation, I'll cover how Enable Hybrid Mailflow works in the Exchange on-premises hybrid infrastructure. One question I also ask when planning for migrations is, should the migration be done to the legacy Exchange distribution list migration module? Keep in mind that in Office 365, there are 3 main group types: distribution, security, and the Microsoft 365 group. The DL Conversion v2 module supports allowing administrators to migrate directly from the legacy distribution list model on premises to the Microsoft 365 group. There's potentially some advantages here. For example, end users can leverage the new membership interface in order to manage membership on their own, and M365 groups can be linked to other platforms such as Teams. If you are considering migrating from the legacy Exchange distribution list to the modern Microsoft 365 group, there's some important considerations. Microsoft 365 groups cannot be security principals. They also have no support for nested membership. When it comes to the group structure, they must have a defined owner, and the owner must also be a member. This could cause potential mail flow issues, as legacy distribution lists did not require owners to be members. The groups also support only certain membership types. Mailbox users, mail-enabled users, or guest accounts are eligible to be added to the Microsoft 365 group. There are also some settings of legacy distribution lists that are not available to you on the Microsoft 365 group. For example, bypass moderation from senders or members is not available. If you're looking forward to future presentations, I'll be covering tracking nested groups and enabling hybrid mail flow, auditing and tracking advanced group permissions, and how to use the module to perform multi-threaded distribution list migrations. If you're looking for more information on the DL Conversion v2 migration module, you can find the code posted on GitHub. I welcome any and all submissions as well as issue logging there. You can also email me at dlconversionv2@service.microsoft.com. And as always, happy migrating.